They called it redundancy, as if I were a spare button on a coat no one wore anymore. The official letter was printed on heavy stock, the kind that tries to make betrayal feel polite. There were no goodbyes, only a spreadsheet of names, mine among them, followed by a sterile code, R.01, non-essential, project concluded. But what they never said aloud was that the project hadn't concluded, it had been rebranded. My idea, stripped of my name and stitched into the company's next great innovation, lived on without me. I remember the final meeting before they shut the door behind me. They offered cake. I declined. There's something cruel about sweet things served on bitter days. The man who signed the redundancy order, I knew him. Not in a friendly way, but in the way you know a blade you've seen flash once too close to your skin. He had a handshake like wet paper and eyes that looked past people unless they had something he needed. I had been something once, a brain with a blueprint, a quiet woman who solved loud problems. I disappeared without ceremony, took the severance, packed my dignity into a box, and left behind the mug they'd once given me for most creative strategist. What irony, they kept the strategy, let go of the strategist. For a year, I vanished into the silence. Not out of defeat, but to grow roots where no one thought to look. I freelanced. I wrote. I built quietly under a name that wasn't mine, but soon would be known. While they leveraged my brilliance, I'd birthed something of my own. Then came the message. A recruiter email, standard boilerplate with a dash of desperate charm. They were expanding, rebranding again, seeking strategic innovators. Someone with my skill set, my experience. I laughed, not bitterly, but the way you laugh at a joke the universe tells once you're strong enough to hear it. I accepted the interview. When I walked into the glass tower where I once gave years of my life, it felt like stepping into a museum of ghosts. And there he was, the man who signed the order. Still wearing the same smug suit, still looking past people. But when our eyes met, he paused. Recognition flickered. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just confusion. A glitch in his curated world. I'm sorry, he said after I answered every question with the calm precision of someone who has nothing left to prove. You don't fit the loyalty profile. Loyalty. The word landed like a stone in still water. I smiled then, the kind of smile that carries thunder in its bones. You're right, I replied. I don't belong in a place that confuses loyalty with silence. Or theft. And I left. Not because I'd been rejected, but because I never came to be chosen. I came to look into the eyes of the man who underestimated me and let him see what he'd released. After the interview, I walked past the mirrored lobby where I used to linger, waiting for elevators that carried me up to floors where decisions were made in rooms I was rarely invited into. The kind of rooms where men like him sipped bitter coffee and talked about vision, all while mining ideas from people like me. People who didn't quite fit. They never saw the long nights I spent bent over my sketchpad, layering strategy over possibility like lacquer. They never noticed how I translated chaos into clarity, quietly untangling the messes they made. I was the woman who stayed late, who skipped vacations, who made brilliance look easy. But they never asked who I was, only what I could produce. They didn't know about the migraines. About the calls I'd miss from my sister in hospice because I was too busy saving their timelines. They didn't know I'd lost someone in the middle of Q3 and came back to work 2 days later because silence was the only currency they respected. They never knew that I kept a journal, a thick leather-bound book filled with notes, ideas, dates, and versions of the project before it became their crown jewel. The one they said had been developed by committee. I let them believe that. Because some weapons are sharper when kept sheathed. After I walked out of that interview, I didn't go home. I went to the tiny cafe 2 blocks down where I used to sketch wireframes on napkins. The barista, same as always, greeted me by name. He never forgot. Funny how strangers remember what colleagues ignore. I opened my laptop. The old blueprint glowed back at me, the one they'd stolen and rebranded. My fingerprints were on every line, every pivot. I smiled. Because what they didn't realize was this. They only took the idea. not the mind that made it. And I was no longer looking for a seat at their table. I was building my own. The project I'd birthed in exile, it had matured. Backers were now reaching out. Clients with questions, trust, and capital. They weren't dazzled by brand names or office towers. They wanted substance. They wanted vision, yes, but one with a spine behind it. There is a strange kind of freedom in being discarded. Like a bird finding out the cage was never locked. They had sold my idea to shareholders. I was selling my name to the future. It would take months before they realized what I had done. That while they chased quarterly gains, I'd built something enduring. Something they couldn't touch. I didn't need revenge. I only needed time. 2 weeks passed before I heard from them again. This time it wasn't a recruiter. It was a message sent through my old work email, the one that should have been deactivated, yet wasn't. Another oversight. Or maybe just arrogance. That belief companies have that they own not just your labor but the remnants of your identity. I clicked it open from my phone. One line. Can we talk? Derek. That was his name. The man who signed the order. Funny how I had forgotten it until now. I used to whisper it in meetings when I needed something approved, practiced its inflection like a charm. Now it sat in my inbox like an unpaid debt. I didn't reply. Instead, I logged in. I still had access to the server. Still had permissions. I suppose they assumed I would vanish the way quiet women are expected to, with bowed heads and broken pride. What I found in the back end made me laugh out loud in the middle of a co-working space filled with coffee-sipping dreamers and freelancers wearing headphones like armor. My blueprint. My original version. Still stored in a folder marked archived_concepts. They hadn't even bothered to rename it. They'd stripped it, sure. Polished it. Presented it with fanfare and metrics and buzzwords. But they had kept the bones intact. My bones. And worse, the new updates they'd implemented were breaking. Clients were unhappy. The system couldn't scale the way they'd promised. Their shortcuts were becoming snares. I downloaded the original files and severed the connection for good. This wasn't just a story about betrayal anymore. It was a blueprint for reclamation. I went home that night and pulled the journal from my bookshelf. It smelled of ink and old resolve. I hadn't opened it since the layoff. Each page was a map of the woman I used to be, the one who'd begged to be seen, who'd whispered her brilliance behind boardroom doors, hoping someone would listen. She was gone. But she'd left me a trail. I flipped to a page dated exactly a year before my dismissal. The words stopped me cold. If they ever steal it, let them. I'll make another. Better. Faster. One they'll never understand. A prophecy, written by the part of me that had known this day would come. They were failing. Cracks were forming. They thought they could replicate vision, but all they'd done was photocopy intuition and called it innovation. And now? Now I had allies. The product I had been building quietly, let's call it Aurora for now, had begun attracting attention. Not from venture capitalists chasing quick wins. From people like me. Women who had been overlooked, ideas dismissed, loyalties tested. They wanted in. Not just to fund it. To build it. Together. And we were going to launch soon, right under their nose. I didn't need Derek's apology. I wanted him to watch what loyalty really looked like, not as compliance, but as a reckoning. The world likes to forget women like us. The kind who build without asking permission. The kind who offer ideas only to see them echoed in deeper voices around polished conference tables. The kind who are told we're too quiet, too emotional, too much, and then, not enough. But there are more of us than they think. When I posted the first cryptic teaser about Aurora on a Women in Tech forum, I expected maybe a handful of replies. A few nods of recognition. Solidarity. What I got instead was a wave. Messages poured in. Women from London, Lagos, Toronto, Mumbai. Coders, strategists, designers, systems architects. Every one of them carried their own version of my story. Some were still inside the companies that silenced them. Others had been discarded like I was. But all of them were ready. One message stood out. I remember you. You led that workshop on ethical design 3 years ago. Changed the way I approached my whole team. Whatever you're building, I want in. Her name was Priya, a systems engineer who had built infrastructure for giants and then been quietly let go after raising concerns about algorithmic bias. They said she was disruptive to harmony. We had our first call at midnight, time zones melting under the urgency of shared purpose. She spoke with the calm intensity of a woman who had already fought every battle twice. I don't want revenge, she said. I want to win. Quietly. Elegantly. Absolutely. I smiled. Same. By the end of the week, Aurora had a team of 12. All women. All survivors of erasure. Each one brought something sacred: experience, pain, clarity. We met in digital spaces, lit by pixels and purpose. We worked in whispers, knowing full well the noise would come later. Every night, I lit a candle beside my laptop. A ritual. A reminder. This wasn't just a product. It was a memorial for all the selves we had to bury to survive in their world. And a cradle for the new selves we were birthing. And I, once the woman who was told she didn't fit the loyalty profile, was now architecting something that would redefine the word. Meanwhile, Derek sent another message. We may have moved too quickly last year. Would love to reconnect, hear your thoughts on some of our current pain points. Pain points. That's what he called the slow unraveling of their false empire. I didn't respond. But I did forward the message to Priya, who replied with a single emoji, a matchstick. Let them burn. We were building fire of our own. The first time someone offered to buy Aurora, I was eating reheated noodles at 2 a.m., staring at a wall covered in sticky notes. The offer came in as an email, casual, presumptive, almost flirtatious. We've been watching your team's progress. Very impressed. Let's talk acquisition. I didn't reply. Not because I wasn't tempted, the number was substantial. Enough to buy back every moment of silence I'd endured. But Aurora wasn't for sale. Not now. Maybe not ever. Because this wasn't about money. It was about something far older. Something primal. The need to be seen. On our own terms. I forwarded the email to the team, adding only. We stay the course. Priya replied within minutes. Of course. Let them by shadows. We keep the sun. The weeks that followed were a blur of code, strategy calls, UX testing, and whispered laughs between women who had long forgotten what it felt like to be in rooms without power games. We worked like a symphony, each note distinct, yet part of something vast. By now, Aurora had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just a platform. It was an ecosystem. Built to center equity. Privacy by design. Accessibility as baseline. Intelligence without surveillance. A place where creators and users alike would feel not just respected, but sovereign. The tagline Priya proposed stuck. Build. Belong. Be. We launched a private beta to a curated list of early adopters, all women. Artists. Educators. Healers. Scientists. Storytellers. The feedback was immediate, visceral. One message read. I logged in and didn't feel watched. I don't know how to explain it. But I cried. That's how we knew it was working. Aurora wasn't just a tool. It was a mirror, reflecting the dignity we'd been denied for so long. Then came the leak. Someone from my old company got wind of what we were doing. Not from me, but through the grapevine of quiet women who still walked their halls, invisible but listening. A file labeled potential competitive threats surfaced in an anonymous Dropbox shared with me. There it was. Aurora. Described in bullet points. Misunderstood in every line. They had no idea what it was, only that it frightened them. Underneath, a note scrawled in digital ink. This could be a problem. Founder is emotionally driven. Watch for PR stunts. I laughed so hard I startled the cat off my lap. Emotionally driven. As if that were a flaw. They still didn't understand. Aurora wasn't built from emotion. It was built from what emotion births when it's been caged too long: clarity, purpose, revolution. And we were just getting started. Every company has them. The ones who stay after meetings, scribbling revisions in silence. The ones who bring their own mugs, not for the caffeine, but for the ritual. The ones who never quite speak loud enough in brainstorms, but carry notebooks full of blueprints that could change everything if only someone would ask. I was one of them. And so were most of the women on my team. We were the ones who made systems sing, who fixed broken frameworks with barely a nod of recognition. The ones who were told we were too quiet, not quite leader material, brilliant, but always a but. But now we had no ceilings. No but. And it showed. Priya's latest prototype for Aurora's user permissions system made data breaches statistically irrelevant. Lena, our UX designer, created an onboarding flow so intuitive it reduced support tickets by 90%. And Amara, our strategist, was the kind of visionary who could sketch a full-year roadmap from 3 user testimonials and a cup of lukewarm tea. We were flying. Not high, but deep. Rooted. And yet, in quiet moments between code reviews and midnight brainstorming sessions, old habits crept in. I just wonder if we're moving too fast, Lena said once. I mean, shouldn't we prepare for backlash? Backlash. That ghost again. The lingering fear that boldness would be punished, that success, without permission, was a provocation. I paused before answering, then said, we didn't come this far to shrink. Let them come. We've already survived worse. The first PR hit came a week later. A tech blog ran a piece titled, Disruptive New Platform Led by Disgruntled Ex-Employee. No mention of our product features. No spotlight on the innovation. Just me, reduced to a stereotype. A bitter woman seeking revenge. I printed it out. Hung it on the office corkboard with a yellow sticky note that read, Fuel. The next day, we trended on Twitter. #Aurora Uprising. #Built by the Overlooked. Hundreds of new users signed up. Not because we were shiny, but because we were seen. We didn't respond to the article. We didn't need to. We were too busy building. One night, after a 14-hour sprint, I sat alone in our office kitchen, just me, a cold coffee, and the quiet hum of exhausted triumph. I looked at the skyline that once belonged to men in corner offices who never learned my name. And I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. You should have paid attention when I was the one staying late. Because now they'd have to pay attention. We signed the lease on the new space just before dawn. It wasn't flashy. No exposed brick or artisan espresso bar. Just an old building with quiet bones, a second floor with sunlight that filtered in like forgiveness, and enough outlets for every laptop and dream. We carried in desks ourselves. Hauled chairs, monitors, boxes of cables that no one remembered packing. Laughed when the elevator groaned like it might give up on us before we even got started. But when we stood in the middle of the empty room, dust motes dancing, I felt it. A hum. A presence. The ghost of every silenced idea rising like steam from the floorboards. We were here. Really here. And no one had to ask permission to hang their own name on the door. It started small, the way roots do. A therapist reached out wanting to use Aurora for trauma-informed journaling. A public school district in Oregon requested a private beta to support student projects. An Indigenous storyteller in Canada asked if we could support multiple dialects in our voice recognition API. Yes, and absolutely yes. We weren't chasing scale for the sake of numbers. We were chasing impact that echoed. Systems built not for surveillance or manipulation, but care. Reciprocity. Lena updated our mission statement that week, almost as a joke, but it stuck. We build for the ones they forget. Derek sent another message, this time through LinkedIn. A long, rambling apology, thinly disguised as an invitation. I've been watching your progress. Impressive. Perhaps we judged too quickly. Would love to meet and exchange ideas. I think we could really benefit from your insight. Benefit. That was the word. Not collaborate. Not honor. Just benefit. They still didn't get it. Still trying to pull power from the very people they'd discarded. I didn't respond. But I bookmarked it. Because receipts matter. And so does timing. That weekend, I invited the team to our new space. No laptops. Just food, music, and the slow unfurling of joy. We danced barefoot on the hardwood. Told stories about the first time we knew we were underestimated. Cried. Laughed so hard we hiccuped. In the middle of it all, Priya raised her glass. To being too much, she said. We echoed it back. To being too much. Because somewhere along the way, we had stopped apologizing. We weren't building in rebellion anymore. We were building in truth. We got our first cease and desist letter 2 days after Aurora's public beta hit 10,000 users. It was dressed up in polite legalese, delivered by courier in an envelope too stiff to be anything but a threat. The letterhead was unmistakable, my former company. The one that had let me go on redundancy. Inside, a familiar arrogance bled through the ink. Your current project appears to infringe upon proprietary frameworks developed under your previous employment. We strongly advise immediate cessation of all operations. They used the word proprietary like a blade, forgetting I had built those frameworks from the ground up with my own hands, on my own unpaid weekends, under their disinterested watch. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had failed to learn that I speak their language. I forwarded the letter to our counsel, a woman named Yasmin, who left a top firm last year after being passed over for partner in favor of a man with half her credentials and twice the bravado. Her reply was one line. Already drafting the poetry of our response. I smiled. Not because we were safe, but because we were ready. There's something they don't teach in MBA programs. What happens when the overlooked finally gather? When the quiet ones start sharing receipts and resources. When those who once apologized for being too emotional learn to channel it into strategy sharp enough to draw blood, but ethical enough to never leave a scar where one isn't deserved. We weren't just building software. We were building memory. Aurora's next update included a digital provenance feature, a way to trace the origin of any user-generated idea, visual, or contribution. Designed not just for protection, but for honor. Because we'd all known what it was like to have our work paraded under someone else's name. Not anymore. Now, credit was coded in. Later that night, I revisited my journal. There was an entry from the day I'd been let go. I had written, "They won't remember me. Not in the way I want. Not for the work I did. But one day, they'll remember what happens when silence ends." And now? They remembered. To be continued. Would you like to continue with part 9? Next, ChatGPT. Here is part 9 of 30. Part 9, Echoes in the Boardroom. I didn't plan to go to the conference. It was one of those slick, expensive tech summits where egos shook hands with algorithms and panels featured the same 5 men on rotation. The kind of place where the term female founder was whispered like a novelty, then buried between talks about blockchain and growth hacking. But Aurora had made waves. Enough that we were invited to present. And my team, especially Priya, insisted. "It's not about them," she said. "It's about the ones watching from the back row, wondering if they're next." So I went. Not for applause. Not for exposure. But for the ghost of the girl I used to be, the one who took notes in conferences like this, silently calculating how far the ladder really reached when it was never built for her hands. The morning of the keynote, I wore black. Not out of mourning, but power. My name flashed on the screen before I walked on stage. I heard murmurs ripple through the crowd. A few people clapped. Most didn't know who I was. But they would. I started not with numbers. Not even with Aurora. I started with the letter. The one that told me I was redundant. I was let go because I didn't fit the loyalty profile, I said, voice even. But loyalty should never mean silence. It should never mean erasure. Then I showed them what we'd built. Aurora. A platform with ethics encoded, transparency as default, and community as compass. A space where women, BIPOC creators, queer voices, and disabled innovators had already begun shaping the ecosystem in ways old platforms couldn't imagine. I didn't raise my voice once. Didn't need to. Because the data spoke. The users spoke. The stories, all those soft revolutions blooming in the margins, spoke. When I stepped off stage, there was a pause. A breath. Then a standing ovation. But it wasn't the applause that moved me. It was the young woman in the third row, wiping tears, whispering to the person beside her, "That's me. She's telling my story." Backstage, Derek waited. Of course he did. He looked thinner. More tired. Or maybe it was just that I no longer needed anything from him, and that stripped him of all illusion. "I watched your talk," he said, holding out a hand. I didn't take it. "I underestimated you," he added, a sheepish smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "No," I replied. "You erased me." His smile faltered. "We should talk," he said. "I think we just did." And I walked away. Not victorious. Just whole. Which is far rarer. Weeks passed after the summit. My inbox, once silent, now buzzed with opportunities, venture capital firms, podcasts, even a request from a university to guest lecture. Yet, amidst the flurry, one message stood out like a bloodstain on silk. Subject: Invitation to board dinner. Fenwick Tech. I stared at it, heart hammering. Fenwick. The name I once whispered like a curse, now summoning me back as if nothing had happened. They wanted me to attend their annual board dinner as an honored guest alumna, a gesture, no doubt, wrapped in polished guilt. I didn't reply immediately. I forwarded it to Priya instead. "Should I?" I asked. Her response came quickly. "Only if you wear red." Red. The color of warning. Of rebirth. Of power reclaimed. The venue was all mahogany panels and dimmed chandeliers, designed to impress, but suffocating in its pretension. I arrived fashionably late, in a scarlet silk jumpsuit that made no apology. The whisper started before I reached the coat check. Some knew my face. Others only my story. A few avoided eye contact altogether. The host, some junior VP who barely looked old enough to drink, greeted me with forced warmth. "We're honored to have you back," he said, ushering me in. As I walked through the room, I caught sight of Derek, standing near the bar, flanked by men in suits. He didn't smile, just stared. I raised my glass to him. Not in toast. In reminder. Dinner was a study in passive-aggressive decorum. They toasted to visionary leadership, paraded stats and milestones that leaned heavily on groundwork I had laid, groundwork they had once dismissed, ridiculed, or monetized without credit. When the floor opened for remarks, a nervous-looking board member mentioned me by name. We'd be remiss not to acknowledge the early contributions of someone in this room. Every head turned. I stood slowly, letting silence thicken. "Thank you," I said. But contribution implies permission. What I gave freely, until it was taken. You could hear the knives scraping plates. I left before dessert, but not before placing a small envelope on the CEO's plate. Inside was a photo. Me, Priya, and 3 other Aurora founders. Behind us, a billboard that read, "You don't have to steal brilliance. You can build it together." The message was clear. I hadn't come to mend old bridges. I came to burn the blueprint. The fallout from the board dinner was swift, not dramatic, not explosive, just pervasive, like the scent of smoke long after a fire has been put out. A tech blog picked up on my quiet rebuke and titled their piece, "The woman they let go is now leading the future they can't catch." It went viral. Not because it was scandalous. Because it was true. Aurora's waitlist doubled in 48 hours. We weren't a threat anymore. We were the alternative. A proof of concept for every dismissed visionary, every woman told she wasn't strategic, every brilliant mind that had once been boxed in by committee politics and glass ceilings. The press called it poetic justice. But it wasn't poetry we were after. It was permanence. Our team grew to 30. Women and non-binary builders. People from rural towns, war-torn cities, over-policed neighborhoods. Each one brought a fragment of a future that had no space in the corporate scripts they'd been handed. We didn't do team-building exercises. We built trust through sweat equity and shared silence. The kind that falls over a call when someone finally says, "I almost gave up. I thought I was alone." Then comes the echo. "You're not." One night, I walked through the new office, real wood floors, second-hand lamps, plants curling toward the morning sun. Priya was asleep at her desk, glasses tilted, code on screen. I didn't wake her. I just stood there a moment, watching. We'd built a haven. Not just for ourselves, but for the ones still stuck in places where brilliance is mined, not nurtured. I thought about Grandma. How she used to say, "Build something that doesn't need you to exist. Then you'll know it's strong." Aurora was becoming that. A system with spine. A home without hierarchy. And in the quiet hum of that office, I realized something. This wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a legacy. A month after the board dinner, I received an invitation from a nonprofit tech coalition. They wanted Aurora at the table for a summit on ethical innovation. The kind of summit where policymakers, investors, and corporate giants pretended to listen while planning their next acquisition. We almost declined. But then Priya said something that made me stop mid-sentence. If we don't show up, they'll write the future without us. Again. So we showed up. Not to network. Not to charm. To testify. The room was sleek, sharp, and self-congratulatory. Panels flanked by smiling faces, discussions punctuated by rehearsed empathy. I recognized some of them, former colleagues, rivals, men who once brushed off my suggestions in meeting rooms with phrases like, "Let's circle back to that." They saw my name on the schedule and raised brows. Some offered tight-lipped nods. Others whispered like children caught cheating. Aurora's panel was scheduled just before lunch, strategic, they'd said, to set the tone. We said it. I stood beside Priya, our CTO Noor, and Lena from UX. No slides. No buzzwords. Just stories. Of exploitation masked as opportunity. Of systems that failed the very people they claimed to serve. Of quiet revolutions born in the margins. Then we showed Aurora. Not the numbers, the lives. Screens showing how users had built safe havens, how students were using our tools to organize community libraries, how small-town entrepreneurs had found platforms that didn't demand their soul for visibility. The silence in the room turned heavy. Not from doubt. From reckoning. When we finished, no one clapped right away. But one woman older, in a sharp gray suit, stood. She said, "This is what we were trying to describe in every diversity report. You built it instead." She wasn't crying, but her voice trembled in the way truth does when it's finally spoken aloud. Afterward, Derek approached me again. Of course he did. "You've made quite the impact," he said. "We'd be open to collaborating. Perhaps a shared initiative." I looked at him. The man who once told me I didn't fit the loyalty profile. Who had mined my work and discarded my presence. "No," I said. "You don't get to borrow credibility after burning trust." He blinked, as if confused by the refusal. I walked away. Not in anger. In clarity. Because forgiveness doesn't require return. And some bridges are stronger when burned. A week after the summit, I received a box in the mail. No return address. No markings. Inside, a bundle of letters, each one sealed with wax, deep crimson like old wounds. No instructions, just names written in delicate script. Mine, Priya's, Noor's, Lena's. A few others from our team. At first, I thought it was some poetic marketing ploy. Until I opened mine. It was from her. The woman in gray from the summit. A former executive at one of the largest software firms in the country. She had stepped down quietly last year, citing personal reasons. But the letter told a different story. I left because I saw what we were building and who we were building it on top of. I saw you. I watched them dismiss you. I watched them fear you. She went on to describe a silent network of women across industries who had been taking notes, keeping records, archiving moments of microaggression and institutional theft. "You didn't just build a platform," she wrote. "You created proof. that our brilliance was never the anomaly, it was the infrastructure. I folded the letter slowly, pressing the paper to my chest. Then I read the rest. Each letter was a testimony, a confession, a vow. Women who had once held influence in toxic systems, now choosing to invest, mentor, and uplift. They wanted to redirect their power, not to center themselves, but to fuel the future. We had started a quiet revolution. Not loud, not bloody, but rooted and rising. I gathered the team that night, laying the letters on the table. We read them together. There were tears. And silence. And finally, laughter, the kind that breaks loose when grief finds its purpose. We realized then, this was no longer just our story. It was a movement. And it would need space to grow. We began planning the next phase of Aurora. Not just as a platform, but as a foundation. One that would outlive us. We called it Project Hearth. A name born from a simple idea that brilliance needs warmth, not scrutiny. That innovation, like fire, thrives when tended, not when stolen, starved, or shoved into corners. Hearth would be Aurora's next evolution. Not just a digital space, a real one. A network of creative sanctuaries, co-working havens, community labs, mentorship hubs. Places where women and marginalized voices could build, rest, and rise without having to beg for funding or flatten their stories for palatability. We mapped it out like we were drawing constellations. Dot by dot, location by location. Cities and small towns. Places with history. Places where we'd once felt invisible. And we began with Portland. My home. The place where I first learned what it meant to be praised publicly and punished privately. The city that birthed my ambition and tried to silence it in the same breath. We found an old train depot, long abandoned. Wood beams scarred with time. Windows caked with dust. But it had soul. And soul was the one thing they couldn't replicate. Priya ran her hands along the rails embedded in the floor and whispered, "This is where we begin." As we planned the build-out, the messages kept coming. Women from across the world, offering old libraries, community centers, unused barns, ancestral lands. Not just places. Histories. One woman in Georgia wrote, "This land was my grandmother's. She wasn't allowed to learn to read. I want it to be a place where girls write their futures." Another in Kenya. "My mother taught under a tree because her school was burned. I've built a classroom. Now I want a network." We realized we weren't just creating spaces. We were building a map. A new geography. One not defined by profit margins, but by memory. Meanwhile, Derek's company announced a Women First initiative. Complete with pink logos and press releases. They called it the Empower Project. Priya rolled her eyes so hard I thought she might see next week. We didn't respond. We didn't need to. Because while they were branding change, we were embodying it. While they polished the glass ceiling, we were planting gardens where there used to be walls. And Hearth, that first old depot, was already alive with plans, sketches, voices, and dreams. We lit the first fire that night, in a reclaimed fireplace at the center of the room. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. Because some revolutions begin not with a bang, but with a match. We never advertised. Not in the traditional sense. No billboards, no Instagram influencers posing with curated captions. No splashy press tours or neon-colored launch parties. Instead, we whispered. And the world listened. Hearth's first location in Portland quietly opened its doors on a rainy Thursday morning. No ribbon cutting. No speeches. Just warmth. Plants in old ceramic pots. Second-hand chairs. The scent of chai and cedar. By noon, it was full. Writers, coders, social workers, teenagers with frayed notebooks and fire in their eyes. Some stayed for hours. Others just came to sit. To breathe in a space where no one asked for credentials or resumes or promises. One woman, maybe mid-40s, stood in the corner for nearly half an hour before finally sitting down at a desk. She opened a leather-bound journal, wrote 2 lines, then wept. No one asked why. We just brought her tea. Because here, healing didn't need justification. Word spread the way stories do in villages and bloodlines. A teacher in Milwaukee read about us in a Reddit thread. A mother in Rio translated our mission statement and posted it on WhatsApp. A girl in Cairo emailed us asking if Hearth could come to her neighborhood someday. Not if. When. And then, the leaks started again. An anonymous tipster forwarded us an internal memo from Derek's company. Aurora/Hearth movement is eroding market share among women-led startups. Recommend strategic acquisition or narrative reclamation. Narrative reclamation. As if stories were assets to be seized. As if lives could be reframed with the right PR spin. I read the memo in full, then forwarded it to the team with the subject line. They're still trying to steal the ending. Priya replied, then we write faster. So we did. Every Thursday, we held community fireside sessions, no mics, no tech, just stories. People came from miles around. To speak, to witness, to remember who they were before someone told them otherwise. That's how we met Zara. A Syrian refugee, 15 years old, fluent in 3 languages, quiet as a dawn storm. She sat in the back for weeks. Never spoke. Just drew elaborate maps, half fantasy, half memory. One night, she finally raised her hand. She told us about her journey. About hiding in walls and borderlands. About losing her father. About how her mother once said, "One day, you will build a place where no one has to hide." Everyone cried. And Zara, she smiled for the first time. That's when we knew. Hearth wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to all who had been made to feel disposable. And now? Now we were igniting. It came wrapped in gold, metaphorically, but almost literally too. An embossed envelope, hand-delivered to our office, sealed with wax that shimmered like something out of a monarch's court. Inside, a letter on thick, cream-colored paper. Formal. Precise. Weighted with intention. An acquisition proposal. They offered numbers most founders would kill for. Enough to fund multiple hearths, to retire every woman on our team, to build a golden parachute that could carry us far from the fire we'd started. The sender? A conglomerate known for swallowing startups whole. The same one that funded Derek's Empower campaign. The irony tasted metallic. I laid the envelope on the table at our next team meeting. No one touched it. No one needed to. We all knew the answer. Still, I read the first few lines aloud. We recognize the extraordinary value Aurora and Hearth have brought to the ecosystem. We would be honored to offer full acquisition with brand autonomy and generous equity terms for all co-founders. Then I stopped and burned it in the fireplace. Right there, in the center of our Portland space, while a few members of the community watched. I held the letter with tongs and lit it with a match, watching the script curl into ash. Some revolutions don't need negotiation. They need boundaries. That night, I sat with Noor on the rooftop, a blanket over our knees, the city lights like small fires in the dark. I worry sometimes, she said quietly, that they'll never stop trying to take it, twist it, use it. They might, I said, but we'll be louder than their edits. She nodded, a small smile blooming. You know what scares them most? I added. What? That we're not angry anymore. We're clear. And clarity is something they can't co-opt. We wrote a public letter, signed by every member of the core team. It didn't mention the offer, didn't name the company, didn't point fingers. It simply said, we are not for sale. Because the world we're building isn't built on exit strategies. It's built on staying power. We are here. And we're not leaving. It was shared over 4 million times in 72 hours. And in the quiet after, our waitlist tripled. Because people don't want perfection. They want presence. They want to know someone will stay when the fire dies down. We would. We already were. The email came on a Monday morning, subject line blank. The sender? My mother. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. Not since the day she called, voice trembling, and asked why I had to make everything so public. She'd read about my layoff, the interview, the launch of Aurora, all through the lens of shame, not pride. You could have just moved on, she'd said. As if silence were the higher road. As if erasure were honorable. So I had moved on. Without her. I hesitated before opening the email. Heart racing, fingers cold. Inside, just 2 lines. I saw you on the news. Your father would have called it defiance. I call it grace. No apology. No promises. Just a crack in the wall. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. Outside, Portland was waking slowly, mist clinging to sidewalks, a street musician coaxing lullabies from a battered violin. And I let myself cry. Not because I needed her approval anymore, but because sometimes, even a whisper of recognition from the ones who raised you can feel like light seeping into old wounds. Later that day, I told Priya. She just nodded, eyes kind. You gonna respond? Eventually, I said. But not today. Because some doors, once reopened, need to be approached softly. With caution. With grace. Just like she said. That week, Hearth received a package, no return address, no note. Inside, an old ledger from the 1950s. Faded handwriting, columns of numbers, tiny margin notes. Tucked inside was a photograph. 3 black women in work aprons, standing in front of a general store. Smiling, defiant. On the back, in looping script. They built the first black-owned cooperative in our county. When no bank would fund them, they funded each other. We pinned the photo on our wall. Beneath it, a new plaque. We come from builders. Because we did. Because all of this, Aurora, Hearth, the movement swelling beneath our feet, was not the beginning. It was the continuation. The reclaiming. And we weren't just keeping the fire going. We were passing the match. It was Zara who first called it a constellation. We had just finished mapping our 4th Hearth location, this one in Albuquerque, a converted adobe house donated by a retired professor who had mentored generations of women writers. As we pinned it onto our growing wall map, Zara walked up behind us, eyes scanning the growing network. She pointed to each dot, each thread of string connecting them. You're not building a company, she said. You're drawing stars. A map for the next ones to follow. We stood in silence, watching her. Because she was right. This was no longer just about justice. Or revenge. Or even restoration. It was about guidance. Each Hearth location took on its own rhythm. In New Orleans, a jazz musician taught tech literacy in the evenings, saying every chord was a code, every melody a math. In Nairobi, the community built solar panels with teenage girls, naming them after ancestral grandmothers. In Detroit, they converted an old church into a makerspace, repurposing pews into benches for building. In Toronto, they opened the first Hearth designed specifically for trans youth, not as an outreach, but as origin. These places didn't ask permission. They whispered, "Come as you are." And people did. In waves. Back in Portland, we hosted our first inter-Hearth gathering. Representatives from every location. People who had once felt like anomalies in their own lives, now standing side by side in a circle that didn't need fixing, only widening. Zara was the youngest attendee. She unveiled her final project that night, a digital, interactive map that told stories instead of giving directions. Click on a star and it played a voice. A builder. A survivor. A first-generation dreamer. Each one saying, "Here's where I stood. Here's what I made." We all cried. And we named it the silent thread. Because that's what we had become. Not noise. Not a blaze. But a continuous, quiet pull through time, weaving past into present and present into a possible future. Later that night, I sat with Priya under the stars. "We've done something dangerous," she said. "What do you mean?" "We've made hope replicable." I smiled. Good. And we leaned back, watching our constellation grow. It started as a whisper in a back-channel forum, a thread buried among announcements and questions about accessibility tools. Has anyone done an impact audit on Aurora and Hearth? Like a real one. The post wasn't hostile. Just curious. Almost reverent. But it sparked something. Within days, a team of independent researchers, women, mostly, reached out. Economists, sociologists, anthropologists. They wanted to study the movement, not to quantify it in profits or market share, but in harm reduction, identity reclamation, and community sustainability. We said yes, not for validation, but for memory. They spent 3 months embedded across our hearths, listening, observing, interviewing users, founders, neighbors. The report they published wasn't flashy, but it was seismic. It detailed how Aurora had decreased burnout rates in women-led startups by 47%. How Hearths had prevented over 1,200 evictions through micro-grant programs. How Zara's digital map had inspired a dozen similar initiatives globally. But the most striking number? 94% of participants said this was the first time they felt seen without being used. That line, it stayed with me. Seen without being used. It became our new North Star. We printed the report and distributed it for free. Not as a PR stunt, as gospel. At the next summit, instead of glossy brochures, we handed out zines. Handmade. Annotated by community members. With notes in the margins like, I cried on page 7. That story is my sister's. I didn't know anyone remembered us. The industry didn't know what to do with us. They couldn't spin us. Couldn't buy us. Couldn't reduce us. Because we weren't chasing disruption. We were practicing repair. Meanwhile, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address again. Just a line I recognized immediately. You once said silence was a currency. You've spent it well. I knew who it was from. And I didn't need to respond. Because the work was already answering for me. We hung the audit summary in the entryway of every hearth. Beneath it, a simple inscription. Not for profit. For proof. Because we didn't need to be the biggest. We just needed to be undeniable. In the Portland hearth, there's a room with no screens. We called it the mirror room. It wasn't part of the original blueprint. It came about almost by accident, after a contractor misread the design and installed floor-to-ceiling mirrors instead of white bards. At first, we thought about redoing it. Replacing the glass with something more productive. But then Zara stood in the center one morning, turning slowly, and said, "This is where you come when you forget what you look like." So we kept it. No writing. No tech. Just reflection. It became one of our most visited rooms. People came to cry. To rehearse interviews. To strip away the words others had stuck to them like burrs, too emotional, too intense, too difficult. They came to remember. One woman, a nurse, told us she stood there every Thursday before her shift, just to say her own name out loud. No one says it anymore, she said. At work, I'm just room 3. Another, a trans man from Hearth, Toronto, said it was the first place he ever saw his new self without fear. The mirror room required no explanation. And perhaps that's why it worked. Because we were all a little fractured, a little fogged. Until we stood still long enough to recognize ourselves again. One day, I found a note tucked under the mirror. When they erased me, I stopped trying to be seen. You gave me back my outline. It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. I left a reply below it. And now you fill it in. That evening, I sat alone in the mirror room for the first time in months. No makeup. No armor. Just me, a reflection, and the soft hum of a space that held too many untold stories to ever feel empty. And I whispered to my reflection, the girl who had once been called redundant. You were never extra. You were the edge. And for the first time in years, I believed it. It was Zara again who asked the question that sparked the next transformation. We were gathered in the courtyard of the Portland hearth, autumn leaves rustling like soft applause, the smell of sage and cinnamon in the air. Every month, we hosted a fire circle. No agenda. No keynotes. Just a circle, a flame, and voices. That night, the flame crackled low, casting halos on tired cheeks and calloused hands. Zara, sitting cross-legged with her sketchpad in her lap, looked up and asked, "What are we protecting?" The question floated like smoke. Not who, but what. Because we had fought, built, endured. But were we clear on the treasure buried beneath all our blueprints and burn marks? Priya answered first. Joy. Noor said, time. Lena whispered, freedom from justification. And me? I looked at the fire and said, the right to not be grateful for crumbs. Because for too long, we had been fed the idea that scraps were blessings. That a seat at the table was enough, even if the meal was stolen and the conversation never welcomed our voices. We weren't just protecting a product or a brand. We were protecting the conditions that made belonging possible. The fire circle that night didn't end with applause. It ended with a vow. We would write it into code, into policy, into practice. A public fire doctrine authored by our community, naming what we were here to safeguard. Not just our IP, but our integrity. We called it the fire we tend. A manifesto. But quieter. Warmer. A promise. We protect care. We protect truth, even when it's inconvenient. We protect the space to begin again. We protect one another, even when systems won't. It spread like kindling in dry grass. Translated into 14 languages in 2 weeks. Posted in schools, clinics, co-ops, prisons, and refugee centers. Whispered over soup pots. Painted on stairwells. Sewn into quilts. We didn't copyright it. We released it. Because fire by nature is meant to spread. Back at the Portland hearth, we etched the final line of the doctrine into stone, just outside the main door. This fire doesn't burn us. It becomes us. And every time someone walks in, they step over that line. Into a place where they don't have to defend their worth. Only their warmth.